For 3 decades, Johnny Carson welcomed more than 22,000 guests onto The Tonight Show couch. From Hollywood icons to political leaders, from beloved comedians to ordinary people with extraordinary quirks, Carson spoke to them all with his signature mix of charm, wit, and curiosity. But not every encounter on that stage went smoothly. Behind the confident smile and quick humor, Carson was an astute observer of human nature, a man who could sense, almost instantly, when something about a guest felt off. While he always kept his cool before the cameras, those who worked closely with him could recognize the subtle shifts, a slight tightening of posture, a pause before a question, a flicker of unease behind the smile, when a particular guest made him genuinely uncomfortable. Johnny had this uncanny ability to stay calm on live television no matter what, recalled a longtime Tonight Show producer who worked beside him for over 10 years. But behind the scenes, he'd occasionally admit that certain guests truly rattled him, not because they were rude or combative, he could handle that, but because there was something deeply unsettling about their presence. Today, we're revisiting those moments, the 9 guests who most deeply unnerved television's most unflappable host. The celebrities whose appearances left Carson visibly uneasy and led to private remarks about their strange, chilling energy. From manic unpredictability to unnerving stillness, from slurred ramblings to icy hostility, these were the encounters that made even Johnny Carson uneasy in his own domain. But first, let's step back to the moment that started it all. An interview so haunting that Carson later described it as like speaking to someone halfway between this world and the next. Truman Capote was one of America's most celebrated literary figures, the mind behind masterpieces like In Cold Blood and Breakfast at Tiffany's. His unique voice, sharp wit, and eccentric charm made him a favorite guest on talk shows throughout the 1960s and early 70s. But as Capote's long battle with addiction took its toll, his appearances on The Tonight Show began to feel different, increasingly eerie, and, to Johnny, profoundly disturbing. In his later years, Truman had this presence that Johnny found deeply unnerving, said a director who worked several of Capote's interviews. He would speak in this faint, whispery tone, drifting off mid-sentence, pausing for what felt like forever, then suddenly continuing as if no time had passed. Johnny once said it felt like trying to interview a ghost slipping in and out of our reality. One appearance in particular, in 1975, left a mark that Carson never forgot. Capote arrived clearly intoxicated, slurring his words and rambling through disconnected monologues about death, celebrity scandals, and strange paranormal experiences. This wasn't the witty gossip storyteller Johnny had prepared for, this was something else. Something that sent a chill through the room. You could feel it in the studio, recalled a camera operator who filmed that night. No one knew whether to laugh or feel concerned. He wasn't just drunk, he felt haunted. He kept staring off into empty space and smiling at nothing. Johnny kept glancing in the same direction, trying to figure out what Truman was even looking at. The tension grew so unbearable that the producers made a rare decision. They cut the segment short. During the commercial break, Carson reportedly turned to his producer and muttered. He sounded like a haunted house whispering its own autobiography. When they returned on air, Carson told viewers that Capote wasn't feeling well and swiftly moved to the next segment. But it wasn't just the intoxication that bothered Johnny. He had dealt with plenty of guests under the influence. What truly disturbed him was the combination. The fragile body, the trembling hands, the ghostly voice, and the dark, cryptic stories he told. Capote was mumbling these half-coherent tales about people he claimed had died mysteriously, recalled one writer who was in the audience that night. Then he'd giggle softly, like it was all some private joke only he understood. Johnny tried to diffuse the tension, tossing in a few jokes to lighten the air, but Truman would only grin faintly and whisper, "You don't really believe that, do you, Johnny?" That single line, quiet, taunting, froze the room. Even though Carson never broke his professional composure, his colleagues could tell something was off. After the show, Johnny told us, "I don't mind difficult guests, but that was like interviewing someone already halfway into the afterlife," a longtime associate remembered. He was genuinely creeped out, and that never happened. In the aftermath, Carson made the decision to pause Capote's future invitations, not out of anger or punishment, but because the experience had been so unnerving, he didn't want to risk repeating it. Years later, when Capote finally returned to The Tonight Show, the staff quietly implemented new precautions, making sure he was sober and stable before going on air. But even then, those who watched Carson closely said his guard never dropped. He laughed, he smiled, but his eyes? They never stopped watching Capote carefully, as if he were waiting for that ghostly presence to flicker back into view. If Truman Capote brought ghostly silence to Carson's stage, Klaus Kinski brought fire, raw, uncontained, and unpredictable. The German actor was famous for his volcanic performances in Werner Herzog's films, like Aguirre, The Wrath of God and Nosferatu the Vampire. He was equally notorious for his explosive temper and erratic behavior both on and off camera. When Kinski appeared on The Tonight Show in the late 1970s to promote a new project, Carson, and everyone else in the studio, experienced a level of chaotic intensity they'd never seen before. From the second he stepped on stage, you could feel the danger, remembered a stage manager who was there that night. He had these wild, unblinking eyes, like he was ready to fight the air itself. His hands were trembling, but it wasn't nerves. It was rage. You could see it burning inside him. Normally, Carson leaned toward his guests, relaxed, engaged. But that night, he kept leaning back, almost instinctively trying to create space between himself and Kinski. What made the interview even more uncomfortable wasn't just the aggression, but the disconnect. Carson would ask a simple question about Kinski's new film, and the actor would launch into an angry, apocalyptic rant about art, God, and the corruption of humanity. When Johnny tried to interject with a little humor, recalled another crew member, Kinski just turned and stared at him. That stare was so cold, so filled with contempt, the audience literally gasped. Carson's trademark calm was slipping, not visibly, but in the smallest ways. His smile tightened. His jokes came slower. Even the laughter from the audience sounded uncertain, as if no one was sure whether they were supposed to laugh at all. The producers later admitted that, for the first time in years, they were genuinely afraid of what might happen on live television. Kinski's energy wasn't performative, it felt dangerous. Every word was charged, every gesture unpredictable. That night, when the show ended, Carson reportedly walked off stage and exhaled deeply before muttering to a staff member. That man didn't need an audience, he needed an exorcism. "We had the security crew on edge that night," shared a producer who'd been on set. No one knew if he'd finished the interview or suddenly flipped the entire desk. During the break, we actually debated cutting the segment short for everyone's safety. Johnny was tense, really tense. You could see him calculating every move, figuring out how to handle this volatile man without setting him off. Carson kept the conversation going, his calm exterior masking a clear unease. He subtly shifted his chair, widening the distance between himself and Kinski. Crew members later admitted that Johnny had confided afterward, it was the first time he truly wondered if a guest might get physically violent on air. "Johnny told me later it felt like sitting next to a live grenade," recalled Ed McMahon in an interview years later. He said, "I wasn't interviewing him, I was just trying to keep him from exploding in front of millions of viewers." When we finally cut to commercial, I'd never seen Johnny look so relieved. What disturbed Carson the most were Kinski's eyes, wide, unblinking, and charged with an energy that felt almost predatory. A camera operator remembered Johnny's comment afterward, "Looking into his eyes was like watching a storm roll in, you could feel something dangerous building." That appearance became infamous among Tonight Show staff, the benchmark for pure, unnerving intensity. 4 years after, whenever a troubling guest was booked, producers would reassure Carson with the same line. "Hey, at least it's not as bad as Kinski." Robert Blake had earned respect as a serious actor, starring in films like In Cold Blood and the hit TV series Beretta. His tough, authentic image promised an engaging conversation, but what Carson got instead was something far darker. "Blake came out with this weird, simmering anger," said a writer who was there that night. "He wasn't just difficult, plenty of guests were. He had this frozen stare that locked onto Johnny every time he asked a question. It felt dangerous. Like he was silently daring Johnny to cross a line." The moment Blake sat down, the entire atmosphere shifted. The usual light chatter evaporated. His answers were curt, cutting, and sarcastic, often challenging Carson's questions or muttering, "Why would you even ask me that?" When Johnny tried to break the tension with humor, Blake would just stare. Long, uncomfortable silence. Then a cold remark that killed the room's energy. "The air went dead," recalled a stagehand. "The audience didn't know how to react. The band stopped smiling." It wasn't playful tension, it was real hostility. Johnny kept changing tactics, serious questions, jokes, anything, but Blake just sat there, radiating that quiet fury. The creepiness wasn't in what Blake said, it was in how still he was. He barely moved, a camera operator remembered. Barely blinked. Just watched Johnny with those lifeless eyes, speaking in this flat, calm tone that didn't match the anger underneath. Carson, always composed, pushed through the interview like a pro. But subtle signs gave him away. A tighter grin, constant glances at his cue cards, and a slight lean that kept him physically distant. "Johnny told me later," said one producer, "that he felt like he was being studied, not spoken to. He said, 'I don't mind a guest not liking me. But Blake, he was observing me. Like I was prey.'" Afterward, Carson made it clear, Blake would never return. Years later, when Blake's name hit the headlines for his legal troubles, Johnny reportedly told a friend, "I'm not shocked. That guy had darkness in him. I could feel it from the couch." Andy Kaufman had already made a name as one of comedy's most unpredictable minds. But when he appeared on The Tonight Show as his abrasive alter ego, lounge singer Tony Clifton, even Carson wasn't ready for the chaos that followed. Carson actually enjoyed Andy's surreal humor when he appeared as himself. But Tony Clifton was another creature entirely. Crude, loud, and relentlessly confrontational. The result wasn't comedy, it was madness. "The Clifton thing was one of a kind," said a Tonight Show producer. "Most awkward guests don't mean to be difficult. Kaufman designed it that way. The problem was, it went from performance art to something genuinely disturbing." Clifton arrived in full costume, a shabby tuxedo, crooked wig, oversized sunglasses, and reeking of cheap cologne. From the second he stepped on stage, he was trouble. He interrupted Carson mid-sentence, threw insults at Ed McMahon, made off-color comments about female staff, and refused to follow any conversational rhythm. "It wasn't just obnoxious," remembered a writer from that night. "It was surreal." He wouldn't drop character no matter how uncomfortable things got. Johnny tried to steer it back to normal, but Clifton would respond with some bizarre one-liner in that awful voice. You couldn't tell if Andy was controlling the act, or if the act was controlling him. The tension peaked when Clifton began to sing, horribly, and, dissatisfied with the band's accompaniment, hurled a glass of water toward musical director Doc Severinsen. At that point, something unprecedented happened. Johnny Carson walked off his own set. "Johnny never walked off," recalled Ed McMahon. "Ever. That's when we knew it wasn't just comedy, it had gone too far." "That's how shaken Johnny was," explained a stage manager who witnessed it firsthand. Once he left the stage, Clifton only got more chaotic, refusing to leave even after the commercial break hit. Security literally had to drag him away while he screamed curses at the crew. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was like watching someone unravel on live television. The fact that it was supposed to be a performance somehow made it even more disturbing. When Carson finally returned after the break, his composure showed its first real crack. Those who knew him could see the tension in his shoulders and the stiffness in his smile, a rare fracture in the famously unflappable host. According to several staff members, Johnny later admitted that what unsettled him most wasn't Clifton's vulgar antics, but the total commitment to the illusion, no matter the cost. "Johnny told us afterward," recalled a longtime associate, "I've dealt with drunks, divas, and people having meltdowns, but this was something else. It was unnerving to watch someone so deep in character that they refused to recognize reality." He said it felt like interviewing a man from another dimension, one with its own rules, logic, and madness. That kind of dedication to chaos, the associate added, genuinely creeped him out. The response backstage was swift and final. While Andy Kaufman himself remained a welcome guest, Carson personally requested that the Tony Clifton persona be permanently banned from The Tonight Show. As one producer summed it up, Johnny could deal with difficult. He could even handle bizarre. But Clifton crossed the line, from eccentric to outright disturbing. Number 5. George Jessel, the racist relic. George Jessel was a relic from a different era, a vaudeville performer and early Hollywood producer whose career stretched back to the dawn of the 20th century. By the time he appeared on The Tonight Show in the early 1970s, Jessel was well into his 70s, a living link to an entertainment world long gone. What Carson couldn't have foreseen was that this appearance would turn into one of the most excruciatingly uncomfortable segments in the show's history. Jessel came from a time when racial and ethnic jokes were just part of the act, explained a writer who was on set that evening. But by the 1970s, that kind of material wasn't just outdated, it was offensive. Johnny always tried to keep the show modern and respectful, so he was completely blindsided by what came out of Jessel's mouth. The trouble began almost immediately. After a short, polite introduction, Carson invited Jessel to reflect on his long career in show business. Instead of offering nostalgic stories or harmless anecdotes, Jessel dove straight into what one crew member later described as a greatest hits reel of every awful thing you could possibly say. The monologue was filled with racist slurs, cruel stereotypes, and jokes that might have drawn laughs in the 1920s but left the 1970s audience horrified. The studio went dead silent, recalled a camera operator. Not the kind of silence where a joke flops, the kind where everyone's thinking, did he really just say that? Johnny froze. You could see him smiling through the panic, trying to figure out how to stop this train wreck without turning it into a bigger disaster. What made it even more disturbing wasn't just the words, it was Jessel's complete obliviousness. He seemed genuinely unaware of how appalling his material was. As the audience sat frozen in disbelief, Jessel continued, pausing only to look confused when no laughter came. Johnny was trapped, said a producer in the control booth that night. If he confronted Jessel directly, it'd look like he was attacking an old man on live TV. If he laughed along, it'd seem like he agreed. And if he cut the segment, the reason would be obvious. I'd never seen him that visibly uncomfortable. Carson's solution was decisive. He abruptly cut to commercial several minutes early. When the show returned, Jessel was gone, replaced by the next guest. Backstage, Carson was reportedly furious. "That's not what this show stands for," he told his producer. "That kind of thing will never happen here again." Most troublesome guests were eventually invited back after tempers cooled, but not Jessel. He was permanently blacklisted from the guest list. The incident also changed how The Tonight Show operated behind the scenes. From that night on, producers began conducting more rigorous pre-interviews, especially with older entertainers whose humor might not have aged well. What truly bothered Johnny, said a close associate, wasn't just the language. It was the way Jessel seemed like a ghost from another world, completely disconnected from the time he was standing in. That total lack of awareness was haunting. After that night, Jessel's name became a kind of shorthand in the production office. Whenever a questionable guest came up, someone would inevitably ask, could this turn into another Jessel situation? That one name was enough to make even the most daring booker think twice. Divine, the flamboyant drag performer who rose to fame through John Waters's boundary-pushing films like Pink Flamingos and Female Trouble, was already a countercultural legend when booked on The Tonight Show in the mid-1970s. Wearing an elaborate beehive wig, dramatic makeup, and a deliberately provocative attitude, Divine embodied everything that mainstream America of that decade found challenging, and that alone was enough to visibly rattle even the unflappable Johnny Carson. This was long before RuPaul's Drag Race or any sense of mainstream acceptance for drag artistry, explained a talent coordinator who worked on the show. Having Divine appear on a national network talk show was absolutely shocking for the time. Johnny, though progressive in his booking choices, was still fairly traditional at heart. And from the moment Divine walked onto the stage, it was clear he was out of his comfort zone. What made Divine's presence particularly disquieting wasn't aggression or confrontation. By every account, Divine was professional and well prepared. It was the intentional defiance of gender conventions and social expectations that created a tangible unease throughout the segment. Johnny remained polite, recalled one director from that night. But he was clearly unsettled. He kept a little more physical distance than usual. His laughter felt more nervous than natural, and he was off his rhythm through the whole exchange. You could see him struggling to figure out the right tone. Should he treat Divine as a serious artist, a novelty, a provocateur? He never quite settled on it. The studio audience's reaction only deepened the tension. Some chuckled uneasily. Others sat in confused silence. Network censors were on edge, alert for anything that might breach the strict broadcast rules of the era. That strange cocktail of confusion and caution created an atmosphere Johnny couldn't quite command, a rarity for him. Johnny was caught between his duty to make guests feel comfortable and his obvious personal unease, noted a writer who witnessed the taping. He kept glancing at Ed McMahon like he was silently asking, "What do I do here?" When Divine mentioned John Waters's famously transgressive films, Carson had no frame of reference. He didn't know how to respond to the mention of the outrageous scenes that had made Divine famous. While Carson never once disrespected Divine, those who knew him could read the relief in his body language the second the segment wrapped. A producer later remembered, "As soon as the cameras cut, Johnny turned to me and said, 'Well, that was certainly something different for the folks in Omaha tonight.'" It was his polite way of saying he'd been completely thrown off balance. Divine's appearance remained significant because it exposed Carson's internal tug-of-war between his Midwestern sensibilities and the rapidly shifting culture of the 1970s. Despite his clear discomfort, he maintained his professionalism and never crossed into mockery or dismissal. That night became something of a quiet turning point for The Tonight Show. It proved Carson was willing to feature voices that challenged conventional norms, even when they clearly rattled him. As one staff member later put it, Johnny might have been uneasy, but he never let that stop him from giving viewers something bold and thought-provoking. Unlike most names on this list, Vincent Price wasn't a rare guest, he was a favorite. The legendary horror actor brought a perfect blend of charm, intelligence, and gothic flair that made for irresistibly watchable television. Yet, even as Carson genuinely enjoyed his company, there were moments when Price's presence seemed to genuinely unsettle him. Vincent was one of Johnny's favorites, recalled a longtime Tonight Show producer. But every now and then, he'd truly give Johnny the creeps. Vincent could be chatting about something mundane, cooking, art, travel, and suddenly slip into that bone-chilling horror voice of his. You'd actually see Johnny recoil a bit, even as he laughed. What made Price's visits so unnerving was his uncanny ability to move from charming raconteur to sinister figure without warning. In one unforgettable segment, Price was invited to recite Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven under dim lights and candle glow. As his deep voice grew darker and more intense, cameras caught Carson's very real discomfort. Johnny later said that for a few moments, he completely forgot they were on a TV set, a director recalled. He swore that Vincent's voice actually changed the temperature in the room. Afterward, he joked, "I think Vincent might have summoned something. Did anyone else feel that?" Carson often joked that Price could make even compliments sound like veiled threats, and the remark wasn't far from the truth. During one appearance, Price presented Carson with a rather macabre gift, a small display case containing a mounted taxidermy bat. Johnny's expression mixed politeness, fascination, and thinly veiled discomfort as he held it. Johnny was fascinated by Vincent but also a bit unnerved by him, noted a writer from the show. It wasn't dislike. Far from it. But sometimes Vincent would fix him with this intense stare or drop his voice into that eerie register, and you could see Johnny thinking, "Is he acting right now, or should I be concerned?" Price, of course, seemed fully aware of the effect he had on Johnny, and he leaned into it. He'd occasionally bring along little props, a rubber spider, a fake bat, just to spook the host mid-conversation. Audiences loved it. But behind the laughter, Carson's composure was genuinely tested. One camera operator remembered a particularly chilling moment. Vincent was describing a gruesome scene from his latest horror film when he suddenly grabbed Johnny's wrist and whispered in that haunting tone of his. Johnny actually jumped. After the show, he told us, "For a split second, I thought Vincent was going to bite me." That uneasy chemistry between Carson and Price became legendary. Their exchanges blurred the line between humor and horror, performance and reality. Price's ability to make the air in the studio feel different, heavier, darker, gave his appearances an edge no one else could replicate. Even in a space built for laughter, Vincent Price could make the shadows dance, and for a moment, Johnny Carson himself couldn't quite tell whether to smile or shiver. Price's ability to unnerve Carson while remaining one of the show's most beloved recurring guests revealed something deeper about Johnny's psychology. He could actually enjoy being unsettled, if it came from someone he respected, someone performing with intent. It was a very different response from the one he had to guests who were unintentionally disturbing. As Carson once joked after one of Price's particularly theatrical visits, "Vincent's the only man who can terrify you and still make you hope he'll come back again soon." "Through the books, right?" "Absolutely. And my father and mother also. And the drinking." "Yep. He was an alcoholic." By the late 1970s, Margot Hemingway stood among the world's top fashion icons, the radiant face of Fabergé's Babe perfume and the glamorous granddaughter of literary legend Ernest Hemingway. Her earlier appearances on The Tonight Show had been easygoing and full of charm. But by the early 1980s, things had changed, and what was meant to be a simple promotional interview turned into one of the most haunting segments in the show's history. "She came on set for what should have been a standard promo for her new film," recalled a producer who worked that night. "But it was immediately obvious something was wrong. She seemed disoriented, her speech was scattered, and her eyes had this distant, glassy look." Johnny, who was famously perceptive when a guest was struggling, didn't just look uncomfortable. He looked genuinely concerned. What made Margot's appearance so unsettling wasn't anger or conflict, but the overwhelming sense that she was slipping away from reality right in front of the cameras. She'd begin answering Carson's questions clearly, then drift mid-sentence into silence, staring into space for long, uncomfortable stretches before snapping back as if nothing had happened. At other times, she'd reply to questions Johnny hadn't even asked, as though she were having a completely different conversation in her own head. "Johnny kept trying to find solid footing," explained a writer from the staff. "He'd throw her simple, easy questions, just hoping she could anchor herself. But her responses came out rambling and disconnected, almost dreamlike. You could see Johnny's concern shift from professional to personal. He wasn't irritated, he was worried." The studio audience, usually quick to laugh or applaud, fell eerily silent. No one seemed sure how to react. Every so often, a nervous cough echoed through the room. Carson, normally the master of controlling tone and rhythm, seemed powerless to lift the mood. "Johnny's answers got shorter and shorter," remembered a director from the crew. "It wasn't that he was being cold, he was trying to minimize how uncomfortable it was. You could tell he was out of his depth, watching someone go through something fragile and very real." What made the moment even more tragic was what would later come to light. In the years that followed, Margot opened up about her struggles with addiction, bipolar disorder, and the crushing weight of living under her family's famous name. That Tonight Show appearance had captured a woman quietly unraveling, something Johnny seemed to sense instinctively. After the taping, Carson was unusually quiet. "Someone backstage made a joke about her being out of it," recalled a stage manager. "Johnny shut it down instantly. He said, 'That wasn't someone being difficult, that was someone in trouble.' He wasn't disturbed by her behavior, he was shaken by what it meant." Years later, when Margot tragically took her own life in 1996, several of the show's longtime staff recalled that night as a chilling warning sign they hadn't fully understood. "Johnny was haunted by it," one producer said quietly. "I think he recognized we were watching something much darker than a bad interview. It wasn't an awkward TV moment, it was a cry for help, happening live, in front of millions." "This is like sitting, at the World's Fair," Carson later mused softly, "riding one of those Ford machines." If Margot Hemingway's appearance was disturbing because of its emotional unraveling, Andy Warhol's was unsettling for the opposite reason, an eerie stillness that felt almost inhuman. Warhol's visit to The Tonight Show in the early 1980s remains one of the most conceptually bizarre interviews Carson ever hosted. Not because Warhol was erratic or difficult, but because his deliberate, near-silent performance dismantled the entire structure of what a talk show conversation was supposed to be. It wasn't really an interview, explained a producer who worked on the segment. It was performance art, pure and unnerving. Andy barely spoke. When he did, it was 1 or 2 words, said flatly. And most of the time, he just stared straight through Johnny as if he wasn't even there. The effect was instant and overwhelming. From the moment Warhol sat down, the rhythm of the show collapsed. Johnny would ask full, thoughtful questions, and Warhol would respond with a short nod, a vague yeah, or a single clipped phrase, followed by long, unblinking silence. When Carson tried to lighten the mood with humor, Warhol would give a small, knowing smile, the kind that acknowledged the joke but refused to join in. The audience didn't know what to do, said a camera operator. Was it a joke? Was he being ironic? Was he painfully shy? Nobody could tell. And that uncertainty made it 10 times more uncomfortable. Even for Carson, a man who could handle chaos, hecklers, and volatile celebrities with ease, Warhol's deadpan detachment was something different. It wasn't confrontation. It was absence. A vacuum of emotion that made every second feel stretched and hollow. The uncertainty in the studio created a slow, creeping discomfort that spread like static. People shifted uneasily in their seats, coughed at random, and glanced around, silently searching for confirmation that everyone else found this as strange as it felt. Carson tried everything in his considerable host's arsenal. Open-ended questions, pointed prompts about Warhol's art, friendly personal anecdotes meant to spark engagement, even light-hearted remarks about how bizarre the conversation had become. Nothing broke through Warhol's calm wall of detached observation. At one point Johnny just looked at him and asked, "Do you even want to be here?" remembered a writer who watched from backstage. Warhol gave this tiny shrug, not yes, not no, just nothing. It was like trying to interview a statue. Off camera, Carson later joked, that man could have been made of wax. But everyone could tell the unease beneath his humor was genuine. What made Warhol's appearance unlike any other uncomfortable interview was the total lack of familiar tension cues. He wasn't aggressive like Robert Blake, drunk like Capote, or manic like Kinski. Instead, he radiated what one staff member later described as an existential vacuum, bending the normal flow of time and human connection. It wasn't hostility, noted a director who worked that night. It was existential dread. Johnny thrived on conversation, on that spark between two people, and Warhol simply refused to meet him halfway. It was like interviewing a ghost who knew something you didn't. For Carson, the encounter felt profoundly alien. Everything The Tonight Show embodied, warmth, rhythm, and easy charm, seemed inverted. In Warhol's place came silence, distance, and cold detachment. It was the mirror image of what late-night television was supposed to be. When the segment finally ended, Johnny sat frozen for a moment, almost dazed. After the show, recalled a producer who spoke with him backstage, he said, "Either that was the worst interview I've ever done, or it was genius performance art. And I honestly don't know which one bothers me more." He wasn't angry, just deeply unsettled, like he'd brushed up against something he couldn't define. Among Tonight Show staff, the Warhol interview quickly became legend, the ultimate benchmark for awkward silence. In later years, Carson would occasionally mention other difficult guests with a laugh. But he almost never spoke of Warhol again, as if the memory itself was too eerie, too quietly haunting, to revisit.